In the 1880s, Vietnam became a colony of France. During World War II, the Viet Minh, the Revolutionary League for the Independence of Vietnam, emerged, intent on national independence. With the defeat of Japan by the Allies, France reasserted her sovereignty in Vietnam and drove the Viet Minh underground. The leader of the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh, sought and received support for his guerrilla activities from the emerging communist regime in China. As a counter to Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam, France granted independence to the state of Vietnam within the French Union in 1949. The U.S. formally recognized the government of Emperor Dai in 1950, but extensive U.S. military and economic aid could not prevent a stunning French defeat by the Viet Minh at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May 1954. Simultaneously with the fall of Dien Bien Phu, a 14-nation conference seeking an end to the war in Korea was meeting in Geneva. At the request of France, this conference also sought to prevent further fighting in Vietnam between the victorious Viet Minh and a non-communist nationalist government that succeeded the French-controlled administration. In an informal agreement, the Geneva Accords, the conference provisionally divided the territory of Vietnam into two parts at the 17th parallel until July 1956, when an internationally supervised election would determine the government of all of Vietnam. That election never took place, primarily because Dwight Eisenhower did not want it. He didn't support it. He thought that the communists would dominate. He thought they would manipulate the election and it would go in their favor, which would not look good for democracy and democratic countries in general. And so he did not encourage this election to take place. By 1960, Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary tactics and President Diem's unpopular policies finally culminated in the open conflict that the 1954 Geneva Conference had tried to avoid. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy committed the first U.S. military advisors to President Diem, thereafter increasing their numbers to establish a U.S. presence that would bolster morale in South Vietnam. He started out with like 1,000 troops in 1961, and that number had increased to 16,000 in 1963. They weren't referred to as troops, they were referred to as advisors. They were supposed to be advising the South Vietnam government and training their forces. And then, of course, this is eventually just going to become, they're going to become troops and we're going to be involved in the fighting. What would have happened had Kennedy not been assassinated? You know, that's one of the great what-ifs of history. Would he have supported the idea of a larger involvement, a larger presence by the United States? Would he have supported the idea of a war? We just really can't know the answer to that question. In November 1963, just before Kennedy's assassination, the already shaky government of President Diem collapsed under a military coup. And Kennedy supported that overthrow, and he supported the death of Diem because Diem was basically assassinated, and this happened November 1st, 1963. That backfired, resulting in even greater political instability, stronger communist advance, and more U.S. involvement. And of course, Kennedy himself is going to be assassinated at the end of November, and then Lyndon Johnson will take over. And just for basic purposes here, know that Hanoi is the capital of North Vietnam. Saigon is the capital of South Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson assumed the direction of U.S. policy at a time of great instability in South Vietnam. That country would see 7 governments in the year 1964. He faced not only changing governments in South Vietnam, but also a difficult presidential election against conservative Republican Barry Goldwater at home. On August 4th, 1964, he announced the attack in the Gulf of Tonkin, and this attack involved U.S. destroyers and North Vietnamese gunboats firing upon one another in the Gulf, an incident that gave Johnson the opportunity to ask Congress for the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August 1964. It authorized him to take, quote, all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against U.S. forces and to prevent further aggression, end of quote. Full-scale U.S. involvement in Vietnam began in 1965 in a series of steps designed primarily to prevent a North Vietnamese victory. In February, an aerial bombardment began. Johnson's policy of gradual escalation failed. Even after committing 500,000 troops by 1968, and after massive bombing raids, the U.S. was no closer to victory than ever. General William Westmoreland, the U.S. commander, adopted a policy of total destruction that increased American losses and enraged the people of South Vietnam. Westmoreland just kept saying, give me more troops, and we're going to win this. We can win this. And then in January of 1968, the Viet Cong were able to launch attacks all over the country. This becomes the Tet Offensive that demonstrated how futile the U.S. effort was. Westmoreland's tactics led to slaughter, most notably at the village of My Lai. In March 1968, an American company led by Lieutenant William Calley Jr. killed more than 200 unarmed villagers. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson announced he would not run for re-election and that he would reduce U.S. forces while trying to negotiate peace. Vietnam really overshadowed the great successes that he had in domestic policy, and he had figured out that he would not be able to win re-election because of the protest that had broken out all across the country and across college campuses. So he steps away. Kind of comes as a bit of a shock. Bobby Kennedy is running to get the Democratic nomination, and so this is really seen as a good thing for him, and he really looked to be the shoo-in to get that. And then in June of 1968 in Los Angeles, he is going to be assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan. And so when the presidential election takes place, Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate, is actually going to become the person who wins the election. He followed a three-part plan to get the U.S. out of Vietnam. He gradually reduced the number of U.S. troops there, while at the same time he intensified U.S. bombing. His increased military pressure resulted in the 1970 invasion of Cambodia, which set off renewed anti-war protests, most notably at Kent State University, where on May 4th, 1970, 4 students were killed by the National Guard. The peace talks did progress, and in January 1973, they concluded with an American surrender, and the last U.S. troops left Vietnam in 1975. Nixon had to accept defeat because he was deeply involved by that point in covering up the burglary of the Democratic Committee's office during the presidential campaign of 1972. Although the Watergate burglary was kept out of that campaign, the scandal soon was becoming a major issue. You basically had members of the committee. It was the committee to re-elect the president, and they went by the initials CREEP, which is very appropriate for what happened. They had burglarized the Democratic National Party's office in the Watergate apartment complex, and this is discovered. And what then follows is an investigation into that, and ultimately Nixon is going to get caught up in that. When the Senate investigated, it discovered the existence of White House tapes that quickly revealed Nixon's involvement in the scandal. Nixon tried to suppress this evidence, but the Supreme Court ruled that he must hand over the tapes, and a House committee voted to recommend impeachment. And he was told, ultimately told by the chairman of the Republican National Party, who was George Bush Sr., that if the impeachment trial went through, that he would be convicted. And so he decides on August 9th, Nixon decides August 9th, 1974, that he is going to resign, and he becomes the first president in our history to resign. Watergate also resulted in the trial, conviction, and incarceration of several top Nixon administration officials. And it really is a shame because he had won the election. This didn't need to happen, but he was Nixon was a very paranoid individual, and the protests that had erupted over Vietnam had kind of fed that paranoia. And it is a shame because he had really kind of reestablished a better relationship between the Soviet Union and China. He'd become the first U.S. president to visit each one of them, and this was known as détente. This was kind of a lessening of lessening of the tension between those countries and the United States. But again, that kind of gets overshadowed, and does get overshadowed, by Watergate. Gerald Ford, who had replaced Spiro Agnew as vice president when Agnew was convicted of accepting bribes when he was governor of Maryland, becomes president and dooms his presidency by pardoning Nixon for any and all crimes he might have committed. Ford named Nelson Rockefeller as vice president, and this was the only time in our history a president and vice president were not elected. Jimmy Carter wins the election of 1976. His greatest success will be the Camp David Accords, a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. In 1978, Carter also pushed the Panama Canal Treaty through the Senate, which provided for the return of the canal zone to Panama. 1 year later, he extended diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China. His greatest problem was with Iran, where a radical Muslim revolution ousted the Shah in 1978, after which in 1979 students seized the U.S. Embassy and kept its personnel hostage for the rest of Carter's term as president. A failed rescue attempt reinforced the impression that the United States was becoming powerless. In 1980, the U.S. boycotted the Olympics because they were held in Moscow and the Russians had invaded Afghanistan, which is kind of ironic considering the subsequent history and relationship between the U.S. and Afghanistan. But at this point in time, the U.S. is supporting Afghanistan, and because the Soviet Union has invaded them, we're going to take a stand against that, and we are going to boycott the Olympics. And that's it for this time.